it's a misnomer. There's no such thing as deregulation. What really mean by deregulation is simply regulation on behalf of private interests with no pretense of regulating on behalf of the public. That's what deregulation means. And when you hear the term deregulation, you should substitute that. Deregulation means regulation purely on behalf of private parties, not on behalf of the public.
We will help to create an open marketplace where competition and innovation can move as quick as light.
There were two industries in the bill that were explicitly deregulated immediately, one of which were the telephone companies. In 1996, we had 11 or 12 major telephone companies in the United States, the 7 Baby Bells, Sprint, MCI, WorldCom, and AT&T, and GT&E. Today, we're down to about 7, and by all accounts, we might be down to 3 or 4 companies within a few years. What that means is we'll go from a situation where we used to have just a handful of companies that were regulated to we'll have a smaller number of companies with either less regulation in the public interest, more private power. A disaster for us, great for these telephone companies. Radio is the other industry that was explicitly deregulated. Thanks again to a very powerful radio station-owning lobby, a clause was put in that completely changed the ownership restrictions on radio stations in the United States. The limit before 1996 still was only 40 stations nationally that a single company could own, or up to 4 in a single community. The 1996 law erased the national limit altogether. A company could own as many stations as it wanted, and it could own up to 8 in the largest communities. Since 1996, something like 2/3 of all American radio stations have been sold, and the industry has been completely made over. There are a handful of giants now that own most of the radio stations in the country. As a result, what's happened is that radio has gone from being our most democratic medium, our most decentralized, our most creative medium, to being our most regimented, standardized, least interesting medium in the country, hyper-commercialized.
94.7 FM plays the best songs on the radio.
Kiss 95.7.
You won't find a single listener in this country who's satisfied with radio, but the people's interests have nothing to do with how those policies are made. They're made behind closed doors by powerful lobbies, and they're unalterable.
On Capitol Hill today, the second day of hearings on the state of the 3 television networks. Congressmen have been asking what effect the new corporate managements at NBC, CBS, and ABC have had on the news divisions.
Journalism is one of the central problems that face a democratic society, because to have a democratic society, you need to have a vibrant, healthy journalism. It's axiomatic. It's the cornerstone of democratic theory. And what you need from that journalism is a feisty, rigorous accounting of people in power and people who want to be in power. They have to be held accountable so people know what they're doing. You need to have a wide range of opinions on the important issues of the day so people can formulate their own opinions. And you need to have a way to get the truth to come out. So there's some way to check for lies and to get factual accuracy to emerge. What's taken place in the last 15 years in American journalism has been that wall between church and state, between editors and reporters on one side, between owners and advertisers on the other side, has come down.
Since when has the paragon of investigative journalism allowed lawyers to determine the news content on 60 Minutes?
You're questioning our journalistic integrity.
No, I'm questioning your hearing. You hear reasonable and tortious interference. I hear potential Brown and Williamson lawsuit jeopardizing the sale of CBS to Westinghouse.
And so that traditional deal for professional journalism has basically collapsed because the owners no longer think it makes a lot of sense. And what we've seen then in the last 15 years is the crisis of journalism emerge, where basically the professional autonomy of the field has come under sustained attack because it no longer makes commercial sense. Oftentimes people say, well, what about the First Amendment? Well, isn't that our safeguard against tyranny? Isn't that the thing that keeps our press free? And what's really happened is the First Amendment has changed dramatically from when it was written to how it's interpreted today. The First Amendment began in the 1790s as really a noble and wonderful statute, something all Americans should be extremely proud of. And it was meant originally as a social right. We have a right to a free press. We have the right to the free speech, not just for ourselves, but for the entire society. So I have the right to a free press, not so that I can make a newspaper, but also I can consume a vibrant free press. I mean, that's the principle involved.
And the fundamental reason why journalism is held in such high regard by the American public lies in that long-cherished bulwark of liberty, freedom of the press.
The moment of truth for the First Amendment and what it means for the free press came early in the 20th century, when newspapers and journalism increasingly became the province of big corporations, of private companies, of wealthy owners, in increasingly monopolistic markets. Then the question before the courts is, how do you interpret the First Amendment? Is the right of journalists and editors to do what they want without interference, or is it right of owners, investors, to control journalism without interference? In the new corporate regime, though, unfortunately, the courts have unambiguously said the right to a free press goes to the shareholders, the corporate investors. It doesn't go to the editor, it doesn't go to the reporter. They only have their First Amendment rights to the extent the investors grant them to them. The corporations that now own our news media, that increasingly brought them into their massive empires, realize that giving journalists the autonomy to make professional decisions is bad business. It's much better business to hold your news division to a fierce accounting, to make it generate the same sort of profit as your movie division, as your TV division, as your music division. And that means basically fewer resources, less investigative work, less controversial work, more puff pieces, more trivia, more entertainment, more celebrity coverage. And that's exactly what we've got.
And this has to do with the fact that there is a certain formula for success that they all use in order to keep their stock prices high. And that is a very simple one. It is, on the one hand, to show stuff that's as titillating as possible, to keep those ratings up night after night, while at the same time slashing budgets, cutting costs. Eventually, you have Barbara Walters become a kind of pillar of the news establishment, although she's really basically just a celebrity interviewer. You have a kind of alternative universe with shows like Entertainment Tonight, which use the format of this CBS Evening News to cover the day's celebrity gossip. So what this does is it creates a kind of ready market, full-time, for stories that are high on sensationalism and low on information.
Monica Lewinsky, the once and future punchline and her trip to the movies.
That's the most economical kind of thing you can have, see. And it's especially valuable when you've got these voracious 24-hour cable news operations. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they've got to fill that up, you know. They got to keep the plankton coming into the maw of the whale, you know.
And finally, Christopher Walken is rocking to a new beat.
There's a lot happening in showbiz today.
Hannibal Lecter is lining up for thirds now.
Winona Ryder is back in court for her shoplifting trial.
And so what we get is a much weaker journalism, a journalism that tends towards cover the easy stories about celebrities and royal families, whose idea of balanced political reporting is simply to put a mic in front of a Republican, then get a Democratic opinion, but almost never means going out and then figuring out who's telling the truth, actually doing the journalism of investigating the various claims and telling us what's actually going on. This leads to very serious problems when you get into a situation, for example, like the war we're currently in, the war on terrorism, because claims that are given about the success of this war are no longer challenged.
The fight against terrorism has begun.
We will bring them to justice, or if that's impossible, we will take justice to them.
President Bush says the country is gearing up to fight a new kind of war.
A small group of elite forces, part of a CIA operation.
U.S. missiles ripping into Taliban barracks overnight.
And one of the things we see is when you look at the journalism in other countries, there's a whole range of issues that are being asked, that are being addressed that we're not getting in our news media, because journalists simply don't have the resources or the commitment from their corporate bosses to do that type of journalism. That type of journalism would get the media in hot water with people in Washington.
You read the Times of India, you read the British newspapers, the Guardian, the Observer, you read the French papers. You get a sense of what was going on. You read the New York Times, you read the Washington Post, you watch TV. It's as if the Pentagon was in charge of the news divisions.
A Muslim community activist accused of trying to help Osama's terror mongers set up a training camp right here in America.
The U.S. introduces a new weapon in the war against terrorists.
American jets are dropping cluster bombs designed to wipe out as many troops as possible.
The Pentagon says these pictures were not authorized, and it is trying to find out who took them.
So knowing that, what we would expect from good journalists